Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephanie Bree. And recently, probably a few weeks ago, I did a video on everything you know about millennials is wrong. And as somebody who meets the metric of a millennial by every metric I laid out in that video, today I kind of want to talk a little bit about Gen Z, because they're the only other generation that I feel has similar shared experiences to millennials, and they're the closest to my age group because as a kid, Generation X, the generation above me, would have been the adults. And while on the surface there was the illusion of economic stability during our childhood, the excesses of the 80s, and there was some relative good times financially in the 90s. Yes, there were still poor people and all those things, but relatively speaking, us millennials enjoyed a more robust economy. At least, like I said, on the surface, more stable economic times than what the Gen Zs would have grown up in. And considering that they came along, post 9/11, the Patriot Act, the introduction of social media, the proliferation of smartphones and the internet and online gaming and microtransactions and all this digital shit, that as millennials we got the early stage. We got to watch it unfold, but we still were, they say that the Gen Z are the first truly digital generation. I disagree with that, because the personal computers started in 1977, 76, and video games started in 1972, arcade machines throughout the 70s. So by the time us millennials were aware, digital was already, we lived in a digital world as well. It's a different type of digital. We had VCRs, those were analog cassette formats, but they had digital clocks. We had digital watches, digital computers. There were digital TVs. We witnessed the introduction of the digital video disc, DVD. We had computers in our schools. And the internet was a thing, but it wasn't the thing yet. So I would argue we were the first generation to grow up in a digital world. Gen Z were the first to grow up in a fully mature digital world. But beyond digital, I would also say interconnected digital world. We had computers in my childhood, but the internet was a thing that did exist, but our concept of it was primarily via television and science fiction. We didn't have most of us didn't have actual real world tangible experiences with the internet until well into our teens, some of us into our adult years. I'm not going to do a video like this analyzing every generation of the modern era, because that would be boring, and the boomers have had their time in the sun. We don't need to give them any more. Okay, so let the sun set on the boomers, and let's just get on with our lives. Moving past that, I want to make one small addition. Not necessarily a correction, but an addition to my previous video on the millennials, where I overemphasized the who are your parents part of the which generation you fall under. And yes, I was going under the scientific biological assumption that, well, you are the offspring of your parents, therefore you are the next generation of your parents. And I understand that these terms have a dual application. Yes, there is that application, but also there's the cultural aspect where we have the shared experiences. And that would be irregardless of your parents' generation because they had different experiences. So a millennial could have boomer parents, technically. But I don't want to get all bent out of shape over that. I said what I said in that video. I primarily mostly stand by it with the additional clarification that I just laid out. My motivation for harping on that aspect so much, even though I know that that's not how these terms are used in the vernacular, was because there is a group of millennials that have the same experiences as millennials. They watch the same movies and TV shows we do. They create the same type of YouTube content. They watch the same YouTube videos. They grew up with computers. But they're allergic to the term millennial, so they made up a name for themselves. Z-lineal or X-lineal or whatever. Because they know they're not Generation X, but they don't want to identify as millennials. And I know part of that is because in between 9/11 and the housing crisis bubble, the millennials were the ones that the older generation were shitting on, dumping on, harping on. And so there were a lot of people that were like, don't blame me, I'm not a millennial. And so during that time, being labeled as a millennial by a lot of people was seen as a negative. And so they wanted to distance themselves from that. I would say that if you were born in the 70s but you lived through the 80s and were still a teenager in the 90s, you're going to have a very similar childhood to those of us that were actually born in the 80s or born later, earlier in the 90s. Because you still grew up in the same, Saturday morning cartoons were toy advertisements, and blockbusters were all big budget spectacles, and MTV was still the thing. So I know there's some disagreement on where the millennial generation starts and stops. Similarly, where the Gen Z starts and stops. I'm going to say this. If you played video games in your childhood, and that includes any of the 8-bit systems, and you watched any of the Star Wars movies when they were new, the original Star Wars movies when they were new, and you were under the age of 18 at the time, I'm going to say you're most likely a millennial, especially if your parents are, Generation X. But I will never accept the X-lineal or Z-lineal or whatever the fuck you call yourselves. So you're millennials. If you don't want to be millennials, then you could call yourselves Gen X. You're not, because you weren't hippies growing up in the Gen X experience. So you have the millennial experience. Get the fuck over it. That was my primary reason for harping on the X-lineals, because they're assholes. Every X-lineal on the planet is a scumbag piece of shit who just doesn't want to identify, who just thinks they're better than the rest of us millennials. So fuck you. You, X-lineals. Fuck you. You're assholes. And I'm not being facetious, and I'm not trolling. I'm goddamn serious. I'm dead fucking serious. You fucking cockroaches. Shut the fuck up. You're goddamn millennials. Get the fuck over it. And stop worrying about what the boomers say. They're all fucking walking fucking corpses at this point anyways. Who gives a flying rat's ass what the boomers have to say anymore? Let's just fuck them. Fuck them. They're irrelevant. Let's get over it and stop worrying about trying to impress the goddamn boomers. They're the ones that fucked up the world. Okay. But I'm not going to put a calendar date on these generations. I know there are some people that do. They like tidy little categories, like, the golden age of comics were from this year to this year. Well, that's messy. Or, the 16-bit generation of video games. Well, the Atari the Intel Intellivision was a 16-bit console that came out in 1978. The TurboGrafx 16 came out in 1987. The Genesis Mega Drive 88-89. The SNES Super Famicom 90-91. The CDI 92. So what? But you had a bunch of 8-bit systems and 16-bit and 32-bit systems all throughout there. So I hate those classifications. Okay, so that to me, I also despise. I identify as a millennial because I recognize that that's the term that applies to the, my peers, essentially. Well, my sister was born in 79. She falls outside the 81 to 95 range that is technically the Wikipedia definition of a millennial. But she grew up in the same household I did. She had the same childhood experience as I did. She wasn't a fucking hippie, She didn't live in the love generation. She didn't grow up in the 70s. So if she's not Gen X, then she has to be a millennial. I know people like to put a flag on the calendar because it's easy, it's tidy, and it helps them process the world. But there is a tremendous amount of overlap, which is where we're going to get into Generation Z, Gen Z, or I'm just going to call them Gen Z. I know some people call them Zillennials or something like that. That's a made-up word. Millennial refers to those of us who were coming of age at the turn of the millennium. That's what it refers to. The generation that was born, and we were children crossing over into adulthood at the turn of the millennium. So younger millennials would have been in the 7, 8, 9 age range in 2000, 2001. The rest of us would have been, well into our teens or even about to hit our 20s. So, Gen Z are the ones that came up after us, right? The calendar date usually says they were born between 97 and like 2012, 13-ish. Well, if millennials were if the cutoff to be a millennial is 95, and the starting point for Gen Z is 97, then what about the kids that were born in 96? Do they not exist? No, that's stupid. That's absurd. Okay, so let's smudge the calendar dates a little bit, and let's put a plus minus 5 years at either end of any generation. Let's just put a plus minus 5 years and call it good. Let's agree to that, and I won't be screaming into the microphone, blowing out your eardrums. I'm gonna turn this fan off because I that might help with the audio. So I do know that Gen Z are the ones that grew up in the social media world. This was the generation that would not have, most of them, some of you might, the older ones, I get backwards, but the older Gen Zs might have some early childhood memories, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, when 9/11 happened. So some of you might have had some impression of 9/11 happening, but not fully having any context or awareness of what it actually was. And so you, the Gen Zs out there, grew up in the post 9/11 world when you achieved social consciousness and social awareness, as in you could observe the world and your whole world wasn't just SpongeBob and Kermit the Frog, when you were actually aware of what was going on around you. The Patriot Act had already been established, and you grew up in a world. The first thing is, yes, you grew up in a world where the internet was readily available, easily accessible, commonplace, and just assumed to always have been there, right? You most likely, if you're Gen Z, don't have any memories of a pre-internet existence, because the internet was already a thing by the time your parents were, making babies, which is you and your siblings. So there's that. Also, you're the ones that by the time you hit your coming of age era, your preteen to early adulthood age range, your adolescence, getting past childhood into your youth, you're the ones that cell phones had already been firmly established. So you most likely, way more likely than the rest of us millennials, and certainly more likely than Gen X, because the technology didn't even exist when Gen X were in high school. You most likely had a cell phone in high school. Your first cell phone was probably either in high school or maybe even middle school for a lot of you. I got my first cell phone when I was in my early 20s, 22, 23. Because while the technology did exist since about the 80s, I mean, the precursor to cellular telephones existed in the 70s, but only the super rich had access to that. So let's not kid ourselves. If you're watching this and you're one of those super rich people, I got a Patreon, but also you can send me money Venmo, and I would be grateful. If not, you're not watching this because you're off doing whatever rich people do. But I like to draw a different, and I know the coming of age after 9/11 is a good marker, a good starting point for Gen Z. That's a good shared experience they would have all understood growing up in a world hearing about 9/11 but having no firsthand memories of it. But I would also like to use a separate metric that I think divides the millennials from the Gen Z. I think a little more concisely than that. And that's the introduction of I'm just going to say the modern age of gaming. Now, I classify the modern age of video games, starting with the introduction of the Sony PlayStation and its competitive cohorts, the N64, the Sega Saturn. I'm not going to put a calendar date on it, because I know PlayStation had a worldwide rollout, so there's depending on which country you lived in, you would have a different launch date. But I'm going to say the introduction of that at the time we classified as next generation. And that's the first time we used the term next gen to refer to the new game consoles. Prior to that, we had no concept of it, because most of us started with the NES. And even though, you had the new systems, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, we didn't really think of those as next gen, because they really weren't. They were just the evolution of what we already had. But going from 8-bit pixel graphics to 16-bit pixel graphics was impressive, and at the time was kind of oh, that's neat. But going from 16-bit 2D graphics to 32-bit CD-ROM multimedia 3D graphics with open worlds and polygons and first-person shooters, that was mind-blowing for us. And so I'm going to say that Gen Zs are the ones that didn't grow up with the pixel art era of gaming. They started their first game systems, probably a PlayStation, a Dreamcast, a PS2, a GameCube, maybe a Wii, maybe an N64, maybe 5 of you had a Saturn. I'm sorry. But your introduction to console video games and the equivalent PC counterparts, the games that were popular on Windows at the time, because again, you grew up in the post-Windows 95 world, where Windows was just where games were, and then Mac and Linux for the weirdos. You have no memories of Commodore and Amiga and Atari and Tandy and all these other companies that used to make competing non-PC PCs, if that makes sense. We do. We have that memory. I have very vivid memories of some people having Commodores and some people having Apples and some people having, Ataris, etc., etc. There was no unified, cohesive, this is what a PC is. This is what PC gaming is in the 80s and early 90s. But starting with Windows 95 and then on, PC gaming refers to playing on a Wintel machine. Gen Z grew up in that world. So to you might have watched a YouTube video on it or read a Wikipedia or studied it in a class in high school, but you have no first-hand experience with the pre-Windows 95 mess that computers were. You grew up in a relatively unified world where PC gaming just meant Windows, essentially. And so 3D gaming, open world gaming, first-person shooters, this moving around in a 3D space with polygonal graphics and texture mapping and bloom lighting and all of these things we recognize as video games today were what you would have grown up with. And yes, I know there were still, the handhelds were still 2D. So you may have had a Game Boy Color, GBA, etc., maybe a DS that had some pixel art games. So you still could have experienced pixel art games, but not on your home console, most likely. You're dedicated, the system your parents had in the living room or that you had in your bedroom was probably 3D focused, that may have had some 2D outliers as just sort of ways to appease those of us that couldn't let go. Even if your first game console was the Wii Sports is a 3D game, technically. So you would have probably played that before you played anything else if you started with the Wii. I don't know what game you would have started with if you had a 360 as a kid, because there was no unifying singular game that united that generation like Nintendo had with the Wii. It was Wii Sports was the game, and then it was just everything else was on the system. There was no singular game that everybody on a 360 had or everybody on a PS3 had. That is usually the case with Nintendo consoles, sidebar, but we're not going down that path right now. I'm just throwing that out there. Gen Zs also grew up in a world where comic book movies were the standard. Like, they just always existed. Every summer you could bet that you could go to the cinema and see a comic book movie. They did exist in the 70s, sporadically. You had Superman in 78, and then Superman 2 in, 79 or 80, and then you had Swamp Thing in 82, and then Batman in 89. And that's it for the decade. You had, and then a couple of canon Superman films, and I mean canon, like Canon Pictures, the Canon Pictures group, as in B-movies, low-budget B-movies with Superman in them. Those are, that's the 80s. Comic book movies weren't the big thing in the 80s. Yes, sci-fi, special effects-driven spectacle, big adventure movies, Aliens, Terminator, Ghostbusters, Beetlejuice, Indiana Jones. These were all big, Back to the Future, Jaws. These were all big sci-fi, action-adventure, blockbuster, visually impressive spectacles that we grew up with. And then in the 90s, you had Independence Day and Men in Black and The Fifth Element, Jurassic Park, etc. But comic book movies really didn't jump off until 2000. You had Blade in 98, which set the stage. You had X-Men in 2000. And then going forward, you had a new comic book movie every summer. Daredevil, X-Men, Hellboy, Spider-Man, Kick-Ass, Elektra, whatever. until we got to the MCU in 2009, which probably for most of you Gen Zs would have either been your the upper end of your grade school elementary experience, or probably going into middle school and high school. And the younger Gen Zs, this was probably like you just don't have any concept of comic book movies didn't used to exist or didn't used to be the thing. And again, I don't want to say there were no comic book movies in the 90s. There were, but they weren't like, they were sporadic. It wasn't guaranteed that you were going to get a new one every year. The best ones weren't that great. Blade was pretty good. Batman Forever, Batman Returns, Batman and Robin, those were like the biggest ones. Your mileage may vary on whether or not you consider those good or not. Horror fans and gothic-leaning kids were probably drawn to Batman Returns. Everybody else probably liked Batman Forever, and nobody likes Batman and Robin except for, the parents of the best script that worked on Batman and Robin. Because, hey, my kid was in that movie while holding the microphone on a stick, but still. Anyways, I'm being a little facetious, but let's be real. Nobody really likes Batman and Robin. And the other comic book movies in the 90s, you wouldn't have known were comic book movies unless somebody told you, because they weren't mainstream comic books. Spawn was relatively mainstream, but like Men in Black was a big movie, but nobody knew it was a comic book. Blade, nobody really knew it was a comic book. The Mask, there's people today that still don't know that The Mask is based on a comic book. And then everything else is stuff like The Phantom or whatever, and then comic book adjacent movies like The Rocketeer and The Shadow that you have to Google if they're comic book movies or not, because they kind of look like it, but they also kind of don't, but you're not sure. And then Judge Dredd happened, and then we collectively tried as a species to forget that Judge Dredd happened, but, well, like Batman and Robin, it has lingered into our consciousness, unfortunately, because it's a virus out there in our pop culture, and there's nothing we can do about it at this point, until somebody invents the flashy thingy from the Men in Black movies. And if there are any other comic book movies or superhero movies in the 90s, they weren't based on actual comic books. They were an original phenomenon that may have got a comic book tie-in. Something like, what the fuck's it called? Like Blank Man, or maybe the one with the, I can't fucking think of it off the top of my head, but there were like off-brand dollar store knockoff comic book, air quotes, comic book superhero movies in the 90s, but not like, there was no, there was that low budget, nobody remembers, Captain America from 1990, and some made-for-TV comic book movies in the 90s, but the concept of the blockbuster being a comic book movie, Star Wars notwithstanding, because it had a comic book tie-in, but let's say, Transformers, the comic book came first. The toys pre-existed, but the toys were import from a collection of non-related toy lines. That doesn't count. The comic book gave us the mythology of the Transformers. The individual toys were just toys. They were just cars and clock radios and shit like that, so there was no mythology. Transformers is a comic book movie. Spider-Man, Daredevil, Kick-Ass, Ghost Rider, Elektra, the X-Men movies, the Wolverine movies, the Deadpool movies, and then later on the MCU. And then things like Hellboy. I'm not sure about Underworld. It has that comic book vibe. Definitely there were a couple more Blade movies that came after the first one. And then even though The Matrix doesn't count, it still has that comic book vibe to it. But that is what I'm talking about. You had these movies that weren't based on established, long-running, mainstream comic book properties outside of an occasional Batman or Superman. Superman Returns was a thing. But then you get to 2009, I think it was, 2008, when the MCU started, which feels like fucking forever ago. So for you, Gen Z, tying this back, you have no real, in your mind, in your childhood recollection of comic book movies not being expected at the cinema. You knew every summer when you went to the theater, there was going to be a comic book movie. Probably 3 to 5 of them that summer. In addition to the Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter, the Matrix, the Star Wars, the Star Treks, etc. I'll put an asterisk on G.I. Joe because I know, again, like Transformers, the comics introduced the mythology, and G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra is based on that, a real American hero mythology, not the previously established, unrelated G.I. Joe 12-inch figures mythology from the 60s and 70s. But G.I. Joe Retaliation, the direct, immediate sequel to Rise of Cobra, did borrow more from the original G.I. Joe mythology, while still trying to continue the story that was established in Rise of Cobra, but also pivoting away from the sci-fi and getting more to a hard, Call of Duty based military unit versus a, Halo based military unit, if that makes sense. Also, Gen Z's, again, you have no concept of, and I think this is one of the reasons why Gen Z's tend to be more complacent and accepting of things like DLC and microtransactions and the exchange of privacy for free, allegedly, goods and services. And Gen Z's also tend to be more allergic to advertisements than millennials. When I was a kid, I turned on the rabbit ears, the TV plug, with the rabbit ears, and I wanted to watch, Power Rangers. Well, I would get like 7 minutes of Power Rangers and then 3 minutes of commercials and then another 7 minutes of Power Rangers and another 3 minutes of commercials. I grew up in a world where commercials were just it was a necessary evil. You had no choice. You had to watch commercials. We didn't have ad blockers. That technology still wouldn't work on broadcast TV, at least not to my knowledge, but maybe if you had a DVR, but even DVRs didn't exist in the 90s until the later 90s, so older today, younger at the time, earlier, younger compared to us, millennials, but the kids, the Gen Zs who were kids when I was a teenager, probably remember vaguely, DVRs and cable TV before the rise of streaming, but you still grew up in a world where access to digital content was more expected than we did. You might not, Netflix streaming, Disney Plus might not have existed when you were a kid, maybe not until you were a teenager or even an adult, but you could still download movies off of iTunes or stream movies off of Amazon Prime because they had that, you could buy a digital, not stream it, but buy a digital movie off of Amazon Prime and then download it to your computer before Netflix was streaming. Or you could buy movies off of Xbox Live or PlayStation Network or whatever it was called at the time. And social media. The earliest, I'm just going to say The earliest services. I'm not going to distinguish between apps, websites, discussion forums, etc., because they're all social media to an extent. The earliest form of what we recognize today as social media would have been the early days of Facebook, which was 2005, MySpace, which was again around 2005, 2003, 4-ish, and then the Yahoo ecosystem, the chat rooms, the Messenger, the Yahoo profiles, etc., GeoCities, the use groups, etc. Use groups, etc. And so Gen Zs grew up in a world where something resembling social media and the evolution of social media was always there. The internet was always there. Most likely your first game console, most likely, or if you didn't own it, you had friends that had a game console that could connect to the internet, either an Xbox or the 5 people that bought the network adapter and connected to their GameCube online to play Phantasy Star Online episode 2 and 3 because nobody else did. And then, the people that knew that the PS2 could connect to the internet, but they didn't care because they were too busy playing Final Fantasy X or Grand Theft Auto Vice City and looking for the hot coffee mod. They didn't have time to connect to the internet. But you still had access to online gaming. It was developing in consoles, but it was fully developed on the PC side of things. And yes, I jumped over the Dreamcast had internet connectivity from the start. Some of the earlier systems had a primitive networking to an extent, some type of connectivity. Even the Atari 2600, the Sega Genesis had the X-Band and the Sega Channel, etc. But, what we think of today as online gaming really starts with, the Dreamcast going forward. Unless you're on a Nintendo console, and then you have to wait till the Wii and the DS, which, whatever. Nintendo marches to their own drummer, and I think that drummer has a broken ankle. So, it is what it is. But, you definitely grew up in a world where flat screen TVs were the norm. Maybe not the standard. You might have still had a CRT, or what we just called them tube TVs back in the day, or just television sets, because we didn't distinguish between tube TVs and flat screens because flat screens didn't exist. So all TVs were tube TVs, so we didn't call them tube TVs, we just called them televisions, or TV sets, or television sets. Sidebar, technically television refers to the radio frequency signal transmitting over the microwave transmitter to your antenna, to your receiver, and your receiver is called a television set. But that's a sidebar just for those who didn't know. But we always just called it TV, which is why it's called TV Guide. Which, again, Gen Z probably has no memory of, because TV Guide was obsolete by the time you were aware of what it would have been. It was probably like, oh, Grandma has this weird magazine. What's a magazine? On her coffee table. What's a coffee table? That tells her what's a program that are coming on her television. What's a television? These are a lot of questions Gen Zs are going to be at. That's a lot of what the fucks for a Gen Z kid. Like, what are these weird things? And don't get me started on Gen Alpha. I have no concept of what a Gen Alpha is. I don't even have any. I know nothing about Gen Alpha. As far as I'm concerned, they're like babies at the daycare center up the road, and that's all I know about Gen Alpha. So if you're Gen Alpha and you're watching this, I'm sorry. I just don't know anything about y'all, because I was not interacting with children well into my 30s. That wouldn't have been appropriate, except for that year that I worked at a daycare center where I was a 3rd grade teacher. Well, assistant teacher. Not 3rd grade, 3-year-old. Sorry, I don't know why I said third grade. But anyways, okay. So then you have this, streaming was becoming a thing, but getting movies on your computer was well established for Gen Z. Even if it wasn't via iTunes or Amazon Prime or even Netflix starting in 2006. Remember, that's how far back Netflix streaming goes. But even if it wasn't that, you still had most likely a DVD player or a DVD-ROM, a DVD drive, in your computer at the time. If you had a desktop or laptop computer at the time, you probably have at least memories of putting a DVD into your computer and watching a movie on your computer. So Gen Z, I would argue, were the first generation that grew up in a world where they watched more movies and television and entertainment on their computers rather than on an actual dedicated television. Most Gen Zs, not all, obviously there's outliers and etc., but I think most Gen Zs, the television was for playing video games, Xbox, Nintendo, PlayStation, whatever, and the computer was for movies and television and later, music, Spotify, Pandora. Remember Pandora? No, you don't. You're a liar. Things like that. Internet radio was a blip, and then it's still out there, but it's still just a blip. And then the rise of podcasts and blogs and then vlogs and things like that. And also, Gen Z would have grown up in a world where, again, depending on what year you were born, but in your childhood, either early childhood, your preteen years, your middle school years, or your high school years, you would have, in somewhere in your under 21 years, would have experienced the early introduction of YouTube and the rise of internet entertainment or intermetainment or whatever the fuck the Rhett and Link GMM guys call it, entertainment or whatever the word is. We just call it content today. Content creators. But you definitely, at some point in your under 21, started watching YouTube, whereas the rest of us, like us millennials and older, we were well into adulthood when YouTube became a thing. I was like probably 23, 24, maybe 25 when YouTube was introduced. I don't know what year specifically YouTube came on. Probably 2005. So I would have been my early to mid 20s when YouTube became a thing. So I had already grown up in the transition from rabbit ears to cable to digital cable to now we have entertainment on the internet. So as a millennial, I got to see the evolution and introduction of that technology. Remember, the Fox network, not Fox News, but like the broadcast over-the-air TV Fox network that shows The Simpsons and football games and Married with Children, didn't even come into existence until like 87, 88. So I got to witness the introduction of Fox as a new network and then the proliferation of cable. Y'all didn't. Cable was this thing that your parents paid for that they watched in the living room or in their bedroom, and you were watching YouTube on your phone or your tablet or your laptop or your game console because you had no interest in Friends or How I Met Your Mother. You were more interested in AVGN or whatever preceded PewDiePie. I don't know that's my point of reference for what would have been popular on YouTube at the time. I don't even know when PewDiePie became a thing. I just remember my introduction to YouTube was AVGN. He was the vehicle that brought a lot of millennials to YouTube. And then also Pat the NES Punk and, we don't talk about the irate gamer because the more people that give him attention, the more it strokes his ego, and then the more he thinks he's relevant and when he's not. And then it offends him when you call him an AVGN knockoff because he gets all bent out of shape even though he is. It's okay, but we'll just throw that out there. For those that don't remember, you can Google it. And the term Google it, is something that's a word, that's a concept that I will argue every Gen Z just knows. It's like you heard. You probably can't remember the first time you heard somebody say Google it, because it's just Google has always existed in your world. I remember the internet directories and search bars and things like that pre-existed Google. Yahoo, Alta Vista, Ask Jeeves, the Yahoo directory, etc., web rings, things like that. It took a while before Google became the de facto standard. But to a Gen Z, it just has always been Google. Google existed before you were born, so you wouldn't have any memories of a pre-Google world, so Googling things was something you always did as a kid. You just always knew. Google it. Even if you were using Bing, or maybe, I don't know what other search engines might have still been floating around in the ether at that time, you still would have said Google it as the term. And you probably had a Twitter, or maybe a Facebook, maybe a MySpace, but probably a Twitter or a Snapchat or an Instagram as early as middle school, maybe even earlier. And so for you, and you might have accessed it via a tablet or a laptop or a desktop before smartphones became the standard, but you still had access to those sites. I didn't start using Twitter on my phone. I always used it on my desktop until 2 years ago. I never accessed Twitter, ever, on my phone. I only used it as a desktop app. A year ago is when I left Twitter, so I only had about a year and a half, thereabouts, where my primary method of accessing Twitter would have been my phone. Prior to that, I only ever accessed it via a laptop or a desktop, because that's me. I'm a millennial. I grew up in the. I'm talking to you from a laptop right now, and I have a desktop buried under this garbage here. I don't have the monitor to hook it up right now, but it's buried under this pile of garbage underneath my table that my laptop is on. So I still have a desktop computer. I have only ever owned one tablet in my entire life. Have no use for it. A tablet, as far as I'm concerned, is a superfluous product. Anything that I can't do on my real computer, my laptop or my desktop, I can do on my phone. So as far as I'm concerned, a tablet is just a why. What's the purpose? It serves no purpose in my world. But to you Gen Zs, you're the opposite. To you, you're like, nah, desktops are just what we used until we could get small enough laptops and then strong enough tablets. So and then I'm going to assume Gen Alpha are the ones that got their first tablet when they were in kindergarten, I guess. I don't know anything about Gen Alpha. But there's a possibility that some of you Gen Zs, especially you younger Gen Zs, probably got a tablet when you were in grade school. And tablets have just always existed in your memories and in your world. And yes, technically tablet computers did exist in the 90s, so they were already a thing. They did exist. The technology was primitive. We also had PDAs and other pseudo-tablet devices that... The smartphone would basically unite all of these different devices together into one device, which is why all of those things that we had in the 90s are gone. Tablets are just sort of a weird holdover from that period, where it's like too big to be a phone, too small to be a useful computer, so I don't understand the purpose of tablets. They just, outside of the one that I plugged into my Wii U as a game controller, and the half tablet that Nintendo tried to pass off as a game system that they call the Switch. I've never really had much interaction with a tablet, even when I owned a tablet, because I got it free with my cell phone when I signed up for my cell phone plan in 2018 or 19. They just gave me a tablet as a thank you for signing up for the cell phone service. I didn't even have to pay for it. I never used it. I had it, I booted it up, logged in, installed a few apps, and then decided my phone was more useful because it's portable and goes with me everywhere I go, and the tablet is this thing I have to lug around, and if I'm going to lug around something, I'm going to put my laptop in a carrying case and take it with me because that's an actual functional computer, and I don't know what the fuck is a tablet. I mean, I know what it is, but what's the fucking point of a tablet? So Gen Z, I'm sorry, you're probably in kindergarten right now. I don't know Gen Alpha. But if you are Gen Z, I'm going to assume you probably migrate. If you didn't start with a tablet, you migrated to it pretty early. And I'm going to assume you either never went back or only went back in your later years, later teens, early 20s, if you discovered PC gaming and you needed a dedicated PC to play games on. That's my assumption. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I also feel like Gen Z probably grew up in a world where political commentary and news are indistinguishable because you grew up in a post Fox News world, podcasts, YouTube, commentators, vloggers, etc. So for you probably never read an actual physical paper newspaper. You may have read some articles online on a website, maybe your local news or the New York Times, etc. Maybe you read it on your tablet, I don't know. You probably don't have very many memories of magazines, or you have like some early childhood memories of magazines, but they were just sort of like this novelty that you got over real quick because you realized it's just a website that somebody printed off, in your perspective, most likely. I'm assuming. And so you probably don't have unless you're like some of those, like the hipsters, as we call them, like the Gen Z that's like, oh, I have a VCR and a collection of VHS tapes and vinyl records, and I have a Walkman that plays cassettes, and I buy old copies of Nintendo Power off of the eBay because you want to connect with the past. I have no problems or issues with that. I assume there are definitely Gen Zs that do that. In fact, I'm going to assume that it's you Gen Zs that are driving the revival of vinyl records, and those of you that are doing that in that one specific context, I'm going to tell you to shove this up your butt, because CD is better than vinyl. And I'm going to raise my voice every time I have to say that because I am pissed off that I can go to Target or Best Buy or Fred Meyer today and buy a fucking vinyl record, but not a goddamn CD. Because of whoever the fuck it is I gotta blame. Gen Z, Gen Alpha, I don't know. The boomers that never let go, I'll blame them, but they're all turning to dust these days anyways. Rest in peace, Ace Frehley. I just found out about him yesterday, and yes, Kiss is one of my favorite bands. So I had to throw that in there as sort of, hey, I'm sorry that I didn't do a whole video on Kiss, but I'm not gonna. But there you go. I don't have any other observations or insights into the Gen Z experience because I'm not Gen Z, and I was 18 in 2000 when the millennium happened. I was 19 when 9/11 happened. So I was already adult when you Gen Zs were babies. So I would have had absolutely no contact with anybody in your generation outside of my sister's kids, which, you know, as an adult figure in their lives, my experiences with them were sharing things from my childhood, teaching them how to play Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, teaching them how to watch The Goonies on their laptops because they had a laptop and didn't have a TV or a VCR or DVD player because that's the world they grew up in. And that's the only point of reference I have for the Gen Z experience, is my sister's kids. All three of my sisters had kids. And they all had, well, let's just say between the three of them, there's multiple kids at various age ranges that I'm going to assume are Gen Z kids, just based on their ages and their experiences. So, yeah, I do know that there were probably, if you're Gen Z, millennials, or even Gen Xers in your life that tried to introduce you or sway you or teach you the things that they grew up with, you know, introduce you to the things from their childhood, because that's what my parents did to me, and I'm going to assume that your parents did you. So yeah, you probably have a parent that is a millennial that gave you a Super Nintendo at some point, or set up the emulator and ROMs on your system, or downloaded you some eShop points for your Nintendo system, whichever one it was you had, to play some Super Mario World or Donkey Kong Country, because that's what your parents have fond memories of and they wanted to share that with you. Yeah, but you weren't going to Target or Kmart to buy a brand new cartridge of Donkey Kong Country in 1995 like I was. There you go. That's the difference. Stay cool.